Confronting the Rise of Anti-Semitism in the U.S., from Conspiracy Theories to Hate Crimes. Good afternoon and welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and this webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. We're very proud to partner today with our wonderful friends at AJC, the American Jewish Committee, with a special shout out to Brian Siegel and Michael Winograd. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Václav Havel Program on Human Rights and Diplomacy, the Jewish Museum of Florida at FIU, Hillel at FIU, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, the European and Eurasian Studies Program, and the Global Jewish Studies Program. I'm David Kramer, a senior fellow in the Green School with the Václav Havel Program and also director of the European and Eurasian Studies Program, and I'll serve as today's moderator. If I may quote from AJC's Brian Siegel from his recent article in the Miami Herald co-authored with the German Consul General Andreas Siegel, anti-Semitism challenges universal interests and values. Left unchecked, it will undermine the essential principles of democratic society. That's why effectively combating anti-Semitism should be a priority for all. Given the rise of cases of anti-Semitism around the globe, and here too in the United States, we thought this webinar today was particularly timely and important. Two of Brian's colleagues at AJC join us for the discussion today. Holly Huffnagel serves as AJC's U.S. Director for Combating Anti-Semitism. And before joining AJC, Holly served as the policy advisor to the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism at the U.S. Department of State, and as a researcher in the Mandel Center of Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And most recently, she was scholar in residence at Oxford University with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Seffi Kogan is Global Director of Young Leadership for AJC, coordinating the organization's activities for the rising generations of American Jews. He oversees AJC's LFT, or Leaders for Tomorrow program for high school students, its campus affairs department, as well as Access, AJC's Young Professional Division. And to get us started, I'm delighted to turn the mic over to John Bussell, a member of the board of AJC and a great friend of FIU and the Green School. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. This is a great opportunity and privilege for me to be participating here as our family foundation, the Shepard Broad Foundation, is engaged supporting both AJC and FIU. As David said, I'm a board member of AJC Miami, and I also serve on the FIU Foundation Board. For many years, our family has sponsored the Ruth and Shepard Broad lecture series at FIU, and it's just terrific that bringing it all together, all these connections into one forum here to address an issue that's of great importance to me and to my family and to both institutions in confronting anti-Semitism. For those of you who are not familiar with AJC, the American Jewish Committee, let me say a few words and I'll hand it back to David. So AJC is the leading global Jewish advocacy organization with unparalleled access to government officials, diplomats, and other world leaders. Through these relationships and our international presence, AJC is able to impact opinion and policy on the issues that matter most: combating rising anti-Semitism and extremism, which we'll address today, defending Israel's place in the world, and safeguarding the rights and freedoms of all people around the world. Here in South Florida, AJC interacts with diplomats, elected officials, and interfaith leaders at the local level. We have formed coalitions with leaders in many different ethnic and religious groups. And with that, I want to thank Seffi and Holly for their participation, and David in his role in moderating. And David, back to you.
John, thanks so much. Really appreciate you being here and for all your tremendous support. It means a great deal to us. Thank you. Holly, let's start with you if we can to get us going. And let's start with some basics. The terms anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. In fact, we received a question even before this webinar started from Howard Horowitz, the finance manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida here, part of FIU, who had sent a similar question saying, how do you differentiate between words and actions that are supposedly anti-Israel from those that are anti-Semitic. Maybe if you could give us a primer on what we're talking about here.
Of course, David. And first, I'll start by saying thank you to you and to Florida International University and AJC Miami for bringing us together today for this timely conversation. And of course, my co-panelist, Sefi Kogan. So starting with terms, I think this is really a jumping off point for our conversation because we have to understand what it is we're talking about. And I usually define anti-Semitism by saying that it is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Often we use Jew hatred interchangeably with anti-Semitism, but I think that certain perception piece is really key because it's actually what makes anti-Semitism different from other forms of hate and bigotry because it's connected to that conspiratorial piece, right? The tropes of Jewish money or power or control. That's not necessarily hatred. And I think that's very important in our understanding of anti-Semitism. To define anti-Zionism, I think it's important we first understand Zionism. And again, we could spend a whole lecture talking about Zionism, but just for brevity, Zionism can be defined simply as the national liberation movement, right, for the Jewish people, or the Jewish people's right to self-determination in their historic homeland. So Zionism says nothing about countries' borders or policies. It's that right to self-determination. And I think today, Zionism means continuing this liberation and supporting the safety and security of Jews living in the Jewish state of Israel. So anti-Zionism then is that opposition to Jews having a Jewish state in their ancestral homeland, that Jews don't have the right to self-determination. And what's so interesting, and I think this gets to Howard's question, is it often takes the discrimination practiced historically against Jews as individuals and employs it, right, against their collective identity. And I've witnessed this a lot over the past decade, really, where Jews have been verbally or physically harassed, or Jewish institutions, houses of worship have been vandalized in response to actions of the state of Israel. And it hasn't been called anti-Semitism. You know, it's been called political actions or anti-Zionism. And that's a real problem.
And let's now get into the trends, sticking with you, Holly, and then we'll turn to Sefi. Looking at the trends, I think, as you've indicated in the past, particularly say in the past 5 or so years, we have seen a real increase in anti-Semitic incidents. And so give us a picture of the trends that we're seeing here.
Of course. And I'll speak to the United States because I think this is kind of what brings us here. These trends here, of course, have echoes all over the world. This is a global challenge. But I think it's important to note that even before the coronavirus pandemic, anti-Semitism in America was already, increasing. And AJC did a landmark survey in October of 2019, which really revealed how American Jews felt about anti-Semitism in America. And we found that almost 9 out of 10 Jews believe that anti-Semitism was a problem in the United States, and 84% said that it had increased in the last 5 years. And what's so interesting is that the data really does reflect American Jews' attitudes. So we know now that between 2013 and 2018, anti-Semitism incidents rose 150%. In 2019, there was a 4-decade high of incidents just for 2019 alone. Every state has reported anti-Semitism, I think maybe with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii. And of course, it's not mandatory to report, which is a whole nother conversation and challenge. And I think it's also important to note when we think about trends is that domestic anti-Semitism has also become more open. And I would argue a little more violent in the last few years as well. And we see this with Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, and Muncie. And I think when we talk about trends, we also have to talk about the why. And the question I get asked a lot is, okay, it's going up, but why? Why is it happening? And no reasons justify anti-Semitism, but I think it's important to discuss a few. And so I don't know if the tech team can actually pull up a slide. I put together a slide of a few reasons. Perfect. Okay, so and again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a few. Maybe I think I picked 7. But it's nice to see all at once. I think so often we spout out these reasons and we don't capture them. And so one reason is a rise in global economic uncertainty. We know this historically, right? Jews are blamed for economic troubles. A second is a fading confidence in governments, specifically in liberal democracies. And Jews fare well in stable democracies, and so that's become a challenge. An increased emphasis on race and national identity. This is not unique to the United States. As we kind of watch the rise in white supremacist movements, this is happening elsewhere around the world as well. A deepening polarization in our society. We know this, we can feel this, and it specifically when it comes to anti-Semitism, is deepening divide over the situation in Israel and Palestine between the political left and the political right, this division. The fading legacy of the Holocaust is another one. And I mean, this is a sad reality, even though we do teach the Holocaust in America, and it's actually, we're much better than other countries. Almost half of all American millennials today cannot name one Nazi concentration camp. So that's a problem. 6, internet and social media. I'm so thankful for it right now as it's bringing us together, but it is a launching pad for conspiracy theories and lies, which we've really seen during this COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, there are more reasons, or there are more sources of anti-Semitism today in America. And I think this is a huge factor that we often not forget about, but we don't talk about. And if you go to the next slide real quick, if I could have one more minute, David, on just this piece, this really speaks to the complexity of anti-Semitism. And I just did a few screen grabs. This is the past few weeks, and I realize I left out Nick Cannon, so I'm sorry, we can talk about him. But if you look at just these pictures here, we see the far right anti-Semitism in the bottom middle. This is close to home, actually, in Florida, in Sarasota, where a perpetrator, white supremacist, graffitied swastikas and Nazi swastikas and other vitriolic statements on synagogues. We saw far left anti-Semitism. There was, right, hit the picture to my left, there was a racial justice march in Washington, D.C., and the protesters were shouting, "Israel, we know you, you murder children too," conjuring up images of the anti-Semitic blood libel. We saw Holocaust distortion, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner, again, of Kansas Governor Laura Kelly with a mask over her, with the Star of David in front of, a railway car, invoking these inappropriately invoking images of the Holocaust. We saw religious extremist anti-Semitism with Luis Farrakhan. We've seen celebrities, again, retweeting and posting some of his videos. And then, of course, there was the Deshaun Jackson incident, which is kind of this weird mixture of falsely quoting Hitler, this far right extremism, also mixed with other anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So just these pictures, which is just the last 2.5, 3 weeks in America, showcase, I think, the complexity of the sources and why it's so difficult to combat anti-Semitism today.
Holly, thanks so much. Terrific way to get us started. So Steffi, let me turn to you. In particular, you're focusing on college campuses and the youth in this country. Give us a sense of how this phenomenon is playing out there.
Yeah. Let me first just say, offer my thanks to FIU for having us, of course, to my colleagues at AJC Miami, to Holly, and to John Bussell and all the folks at the Shepherd Broad Foundation for making this possible. I used to say as recently as 2 or 3 years ago that there had never been a better time to be a Jewish student on America's college campuses. We can get into all the positives, which largely still exist. There is tremendous financial investment from organizations like AJC and Hillel and other organizations into Jewish student life on campus. There's tremendous support for Jewish students on campus. Jewish students are, elevated up to the highest possible positions. University presidents stand by their Jewish communities, et cetera, et cetera. But I really no longer feel that I can say that there's never been a better time to be a Jewish student on America's college campuses. If nothing else, 5 years ago was a better time to be a Jewish student on America's college campuses. I graduated college 6 years ago, as it happens. And that is because of a few factors. We have seen as the far right has gotten bolder in American society in general over the past 4 or 5 years, we have seen corresponding rises on college campuses. not maybe kind of the ivy bedecked kind of idea that some of us have in mind of schools in the Northeast, but schools all across the South and in some places in the Midwest have seen rising far right sentiments among students. And then there's a corresponding rise, and this has been written about a great deal, of an almost totalitarian far left that has come up both among university faculty and among college students. And those two things are actually self-reinforcing. So for example, a couple of years ago, for those of you who recall this name, he was a rising star of the alt-right, Richard Spencer. Nobody really talks so much about him now, but for a while he was on tours of campuses all across the country. And he was going to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a group of far left. So first of all, I'll just make that explicit. Bad enough that Richard Spencer is coming to campus, right? Richard Spencer, who has no love for Jews, is basically a neo-Nazi, although oddly has kind of a fascination with Israel. But for Jews, he's certainly not a fan. Bad enough that Richard Spencer is coming to campus. The protest of Richard Spencer on campus ended up chanting. Let me see if I can get this right. No Zionists, no KKK, resist fascism all the way. So that was how they chose on the far left to register their opposition to a far right figure coming to campus. So what happens? Jews get caught in the middle, and not only caught in the middle, but defamed. Zionists, which 94% of American Jews identify as pro-Israel, Zionists, aka Jews, being tarred with the same brush as fascists and the KKK. It's really grotesque, and that's kind of the tug of war that get Jewish students caught in the middle.
And let me ask you another question. And before I do, let me make a housekeeping announcement. There is the Q&A function for those of you who are watching and following us here today. You can send in questions to Holly and Sefi, and we will do our best to raise your questions during this webinar. What you were just describing, Sefi, leads me to a quote that I was struck by from L.Z. Granderson, a columnist for the LA Times, who wrote recently, "Public chastisement over anti-Semitic comments is fairly muted when compared to the reaction to other racist remarks that we hear." Do you have a sense that there is a different standard in some cases, and not to overgeneralize, but a different standard that's sometimes applied when it comes to anti-Semitic comments, or sometimes people don't even understand that what they're saying is anti-Semitic?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. Let's look at a Florida example, actually, from just the past month. I know that for folks in Miami, Tallahassee probably feels like a world away. But from where I'm sitting in New Jersey, Florida is Florida. But doubtless some people on this call have some connection to FSU. And the student body president of FSU resigned about a month ago after making comments about how his Catholic faith led him to see transgender people. I'm not going to be the arbiter here about whether those comments, are transphobic or are just an expression of faith. Whether the Catholic faith is compatible with kind of social justice movements or not, that is way beyond my remit here. But the young man stepped down. In his place now, the student senate president is elevated to be the kind of highest student body figure on campus. The student senate president has posted on Facebook and Twitter things like F Israel, although he said it less politely, and maintains a website that he appeared to have maybe put together for a class project, in which he compares present-day Israel to Nazi Germany. That is a very clear example of where anti-Israel rhetoric crosses the line into anti-Semitism, as kind of codified in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, which the US Department of Education encourages universities to use in evaluating potential anti-Semitic acts. So, you asked the question, David, is anti-Semitism sometimes treated more lightly or seen differently than other kinds of bigotry? We have a pretty stark example right there, because while our potentially transphobic student lost his leadership position on campus, actually people at FSU have rallied around Ahmed Duraldik, who is the student senate president. The university president, President Thrasher, has kind of issued a statement, maybe even two statements, if I remember correctly, saying anti-Semitism is wrong and has no place in our discourse at FSU. And then case closed for him. And Duraldik issued an apology. It was a nice apology. I'm not sure that it wasn't, written for him by university PR professionals, but he keeps his position. So if we kind of have to, we're basically looking at apples to apples there, two students in two similar leadership positions with two different outcomes. So I'm kind of forced to find myself at the same conclusion that the columnist from the LA Times you cited does as well.
And this is a question for both of you. So let me start with you, Holly, because it also touches on the second slide that you had. You made reference to the I think it was an Instagram that Deshaun Jackson, an NFL star, posted, and then the comments obviously by Nick Cannon that created a stir. It even created a bit of a stir down here when the Miami Heat star Dwayne Wade retweeted it and then apologized for doing so. And so you see these celebrities who are saying things that, again, in other contexts would spark outrage, and yet you see some other celebrities and athletes reaffirming support for what they're saying. What impact does that have on the efforts of AJC and others who are trying to combat this?
Well, the voices that are, the African-American, the Black voices, the people of color voices coming out in condemning anti-Semitism does wonders for our work, but I'll come back to that. I think actually picking up off what Safi was talking about, even I think campus in many ways, college campuses in many ways is a microcosm for what we're even more intense than what we're seeing in broader America. But there have been issues where this, quote unquote cancel culture hasn't been applied evenly when anti-Semitism has been invoked. And to that note, I was actually quite surprised, to be honest, that Viacom fired Nick Cannon for anti-Semitism. It wasn't something that I was expecting would happen because of the trends of not taking anti-Semitism seriously or explaining it away because of ignorance or lack of education or the other reasons why we've seen it kind of been a slap on the wrist. I think what we're seeing now, it needs to be, of course, seen in the context of this broader pursuit of racial justice, right? And unfortunately, there are these undercurrents of anti-Semitism that have seeped into the movements, and we could talk about why that is, whether it's because Jews are perceived as, quote unquote white or quote are privileged. We've even seen some Black celebrities suggesting maybe that Jews in particular are responsible for the oppression of Blacks. And I think that's kind of where we saw some of the Deshaun Jackson, some of these posts, and then Stephen Jackson defending Deshaun Jackson, and a few of this kind of this ripple effect, actually, if you will. Now, many of the celebrities have apologized. Maybe they were forced to, or if they felt forced to, or they wanted to save face. I think there's two ways to go here, though. it's following what's going to happen to them next, like the actions that are going to come after the words. I think that goes back to the first question about words and actions. So they've said the right things in response to this, in response to saying the wrong things. They've now said the right things, but will they change? Will their actions, reflect that different sentiment? Will Nick Cannon no longer make anti-Semitic remarks? Will he no longer invoke Black supremacist language, which actually just has so much anti-Semitism in it? So we need to see that change. And the other thing I'll say here, and this is kind of where anti-Semitism is so complicated, is when you see the response to those apologies, the followers are actually saying, oh, the quote unquote Jews made you apologize. It's somehow proving the anti-Semitism that they believe. And so there's a real need, I think, to encourage, leadership, and it's definitely Black leadership to disavow those statements and say, that there is no place for anti-Semitism here. And again, we really do need to laud and raise the voices of, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Zach Banner and Jamel Hill, who talked about, just because we're victims of prejudice as African Americans, which we are, doesn't mean that we're immune to other forms of prejudice. And that's a real starting point in the conversation.
And this segues, I think, to you, Sefi, on this issue. As Holly just mentioned at the end, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has come out very forcefully in condemning this language, these attacks. Charles Barkley, the same thing. So 2 NBA Hall of Famers. Luther Campbell tweeted saying that African Americans and Jewish Americans need to work together in combating white supremacism. But for young people, they're hearing these different messages. So how do they sort it out? And which ones are more likely to have an impact?
I mean, everyone's going to sort it out differently, right? Like if you're a Phillies fan, you might, if you're an Eagles fan, you might hold what Deshaun Jackson has to say in higher esteem than, if you're in LA and Kareem is still a legend out there. I have no idea what the thought process is that might move an individual person. What's important is that we need to see more and more people of conscience standing up. We're obviously all mourning the passing of Congressman John Lewis this week.
Yeah.
And in 1995, I learned this week, in 1995, when Louis Farrakhan organized the Million Man March, and somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 Black people came out on the National Mall, John Lewis wrote in Newsweek and said, I will not be there. I'm not attending because this is a movement that is, quote, undermined by its chief sponsor. And went further and said that it actually, it was against everything he has fought for. We just need to see more people of conscience like that speaking up. It's amazing to see Kareem do it and to see Charles Barkley. And, when I got home from school every day in high school, I used to turn on ESPN and watch Pardon the Interruption and see, Mike Wilbon giving his kind of hot take on sports at the moment. And so Michael Wilbon of ESPN, who's kind of a giant of sports journalism, speaking out against it. These are all, Black figures in the world of sports. And it's important to hear from them. It's important to hear from everyone. We just need it to be so overwhelming that the only message anyone could take away is that people who are saying these anti-Semitic things are utterly marginal.
And I think if I'm right, the reference you made about John Lewis, Jamie Kirchick had written a piece in the Tablet magazine about that. And a very, very powerful stance that John Lewis took then and continued throughout his entire life, a man of a tremendous principle and values who will be dearly missed for sure. I've got a few questions coming in, so let me try to get some of these out for the two of you to address. One comes from Bobby Schatzman, who asks, how should young Jewish adults deal with, respond to BDS, the boycott, divest, and sanction confrontations, either on university campuses or generally in the community?
Yeah, so BDS is interesting in that it has been a successful failure, maybe we can say. There isn't a single university campus anywhere in the United States that has actually adopted BDS as policy. various different student bodies, student governments have voted to endorse BDS, to ask their university administrators to consider divesting from Israel. No school has actually done it. I don't believe any school will do it. We at AJC are regularly working with university presidents who are that kind of last line of defense to make sure that they understand what Israel is really about, and that they're not susceptible to this kind of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist slander. So a couple weeks ago, I would have been in Israel had I not been under pandemic lockdown with a group of 10 or a dozen university presidents from schools all across the country. That would be the fourth such trip that I've taken, and somewhere more than the 10th. We're the dozenth, the 13th, 14th trip that AJC has sponsored in the past decade or so of university presidents to go to Israel. So it's very important that we work at the administration level. Your question, Bobby, though, of course, is about how should young Jewish adults deal with it. Look, I think they shouldn't overinflate it. They shouldn't get too concerned about it. Jewish students have a lot on their plate. First and foremost, they are students. They are also young people, so they should be learning and they should be having a lot of fun doing it. We in the Jewish community can't expect them to be our kind of shock troops on the front line of some seismic battle, and to put that kind of pressure on them really isn't fair. So if they want to be involved, if they want to be advocates, and my campus affairs department that I oversee works with Jewish students who want to be advocates all the time, we are happy to work with them to empower and equip them to build bridges to other communities. That's what they need to do. That's what's going to be the kind of silver bullet, because the strength of BDS is the coalitions that they're able to build by getting BDS wrapped up in the whole kind of progressive package. Oh, you want to push for measures to defeat climate change? Oh, you want to see racial justice measures enacted? Oh, you want the university to divest from private prisons? All these kinds of, I'll say good. I mean, maybe that will confound someone else's politics, but all of these good things. Well, then you also have to oppose Israel. And to put an even finer point on it, saying to Jewish students, for example, what do you mean you're opposed to the oppression of Black people in this country when you support the oppression of Palestinians in Israel? They would say, these BDS folks would say. So the only response there is to make sure that from the moment you arrive on campus, you are seeking out friends in other communities, in the Black community, in the Latino community, in the LGBT community, in the indigenous community, et cetera, so that when someone from Students for Justice in Palestine, this kind of main antagonist organization, approaches the Black Student Union or some other group and says to them, we're in this progressive fight together, you better support BDS, they will say, well, hold on a second, because David, who lived down the hall from me freshman year, really loves Israel, and I need to talk to him before I can sign on to something like this and understand what it's all about. And at that point, we've already won.
Holly, you mentioned that polarization is a factor in explaining some of the trends, polarization in this country. There's also some real polarization in the state of Israel as well. And some may argue that it's the policies of the Netanyahu government that dredge up such opposition. Is that something that you found in your research and your analysis of this?
And I think there's, yes. And I think there is some confusion, right, about like being critical of policies, which, Israelis are very critical of policies, and as Americans, we are too. And yet when it no longer is criticism. And I think that's just like that, the big question of where this line is. And I want to pick up on what Steffi was saying too, with boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I agree with everything that he said. I think it's really important when we're focusing on victims to define their own prejudice, to how they perceive, whether it be, you know, Blacks and racism or LGBT community and homophobia, women and misogyny. Like, let the victim define what it means to that their prejudice. And I think we're not letting the Jewish community define anti-Semitism in some ways, especially when it comes to Israel-related anti-Semitism. And even though there are loud voices, and even some loud Jewish voices on the left, okay, you know, that are pro-BDS, we have to look at what the majority of American Jews think and believe. And again, going back to that survey I was mentioning, 82% of American Jews believe that BDS is either mostly anti-Semitic or has anti-Semitic supporters. 82%. This is if you want to know what the American Jewish population thinks about BDS, you can look to this information. And then 84% would argue that if you say Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that's also anti-Semitism. So again, looking at the data, and that would be like my advice, even for those, like, especially on the left and the polarization between the political left and the political right, especially for the political left, to look to the voices of the majority of American Jews when they're deciding on these issues as it relates to Israel.
By the way, I think only 74% of American Jews, according to the Pew study in 2013, have a Passover Seder. So when we're citing numbers of American Jews that get north of 80, you're really getting to consensus.
Let me try to bring in a few other questions and comments. Actually, I'll just mention that Nancy Cohen with the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, said, and when we were talking about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's statement, he quotes a song in his article, Strange Fruit, which is written by a Jewish man, Abel Mirapol, and the museum is going to do a program about this song and its composer. So thank you for raising that, Nancy. A question from Josh Gorfinkel, I think maybe for you, Sefi. Please address the significance of President Trump's executive order on combating anti-Semitism on college and university campuses that was issued last December.
Yeah, this was a weird one. I mean, for those of you who kind of followed the whole news story, basically the New York Times, before the order was issued, the New York Times had a story about how President Trump was preparing to declare Jews a nationality. And in the fever swamps of Twitter, you know, people really just assumed the absolute worst. I mean, unimaginably crazy stuff. I had people who I follow on Twitter, I even had friends of mine tweeting that this was the first step to rounding up the Jewish community and sending us off to camps, right? That by, as the New York Times reported, declaring American Jews a nationality, what the president was doing was saying that American Jews are not American, they are Jewish, they are something other. Needless to say, that is not what the executive order was about, as anyone who read it knows. And then you need to actually rewind the clock a little bit, because where this policy starts, which, yes, we are thankful at AJC, we appreciate that President Trump put the power of the president's pen behind this policy, but where does the policy start? It actually started in 2008 in George W. Bush's Department of Education, where an assistant secretary in the department wrote that, you know what, I need to go back even further, I'm sorry. In Title VII, right, Holly, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is about discrimination in institutions receiving government funding. Religion is not included as one of the types of discrimination that is prohibited. Why? Because religious groups lobbied that it shouldn't be. Why did they do that? because, for example, nursing homes receive government funding, and Catholic nursing homes, and for that matter, Jewish nursing homes, want to be able to discriminate a little bit. They want to be able to say, we express a preference for Jews in when we have an open spot. So in order to ensure that these institutions wouldn't be sued for saying, Daughters of Miriam is a nursing home that's going to first and foremost take Jewish elder patients, this was kind of religion as a type of discrimination was lobbied out of Title VII. I think it was Title VII. So now we fast forward. Now that I've filled in that background, we fast forward to 2008, when an assistant secretary in the Bush Department of Education says that for the purposes of evaluating anti-Semitism on college campuses, Jews could be seen as a classification of national origin, because otherwise there is no mechanism to fight anti-Semitism in that part of the law. And they didn't actually say only about Jews. They also included Hindus or any other, and Muslims, and any other religious group that can be perceived to share a national origin. That's that same word perception that Holly was talking about in the definition of anti-Semitism before. So that continued as policy through the Obama administration, and it has continued as policy through the Trump administration. It was on the verge of being passed into law in a bipartisan bill by the US Congress in 2019. Probably it wouldn't have been passed in 2019, it would have been passed in 2020. And then President Trump put it in an executive order. So it is not controversial, or if it is controversial, then it should have been controversial under bipartisan administrations prior to this one. And it should have been controversial when Democratic leaders in the House were championing it. But it became controversial because President Trump's name was attached to it. And that, I think, is really no way at all for someone to fight anti-Semitism. That is to say that the backlash against this executive order is no way to fight anti-Semitism. Sometimes President Trump, even if you don't like him, does good things, just like sometimes President Obama did good things, even if you didn't like him. And we just need to be less disingenuous about this.
I agree with Steffi. Yeah.
Yep.
In terms of the significance, I mean, it was already policy.
Yeah.
Right.
No one. There have been a few suits brought, kind of invoking this. They could have invoked the Dear Colleague letter that was in effect beforehand, which was also kind of federal policy. It hasn't been a breakthrough, tool for Jewish students to defend themselves on college campuses.
So let me return to the questions that are coming in, comments in some cases, and I'll give a shout out to AJC from Karen Orlin, who writes, my first trip to Israel was in October 1973 with AJC. We were there an extra week as a result of the Yom Kippur War. Keep up the good work. So well said, Karen. Holly, this question from Shira Zeller, I think, is tailor-made for you, if you don't mind my saying. What are some ways our non-Jewish friends can be allies?
I was wondering where you were going with tailor-made for me. Yes, it is tailor-made for me in the sense, as David was alluding to. So I'm not Jewish, and I'm kind of committed my career to fighting anti-Semitism. I think the biggest message that HAC is trying to share, even with my appointment in this position, is that because anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, it's not a problem just for Jews to solve. It's a societal problem, right? Anti-Semitism is a reflection on the poor health of our society, and it's really kind of the first they come for the Jews, like that's a barometer of the health of the society, and so we need non-Jews to know the audiences of those who are anti-Semitic. Like, I come from a evangelical Christian background. I know that audience. And in some ways, like, I hope to use that knowledge in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I'm always asked if I'm Jewish, right? Like, I must be Jewish because I'm fighting anti-Semitism. And I love that question because I get to answer, No, I'm not actually. Let me tell you why. But in the fight against like anti-Semitism, and people always also ask, how do you fight something that's irrational? What's the solution? And there really isn't a solution, but there are ways to lower the levels. And one of the most effective ways I've found to date is really through coalition building with non-Jewish partners, organizations, obviously with governments. We're much more effective in the fight against anti-Semitism in that way. I'll make two comments, one on a Muslim-Jewish coalition and also on a Black-Jewish caucus and coalition. So Muslim-Jewish dialogue, I think, is really maybe the interreligious dialogue of it's been called to the 21st century. Like, how are we going to, encourage ties between Muslims and Jews? AJC as a Muslim-Jewish advisory council, where we work on issues related to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, combating them as well. And I have one story I'll share. And I was reminded of it because Steffi made me think about when I was I served in the second Obama administration at the State Department. And when I read the executive order, I looked at it and I said, what's the big deal? This is exactly the language we were using already. So that just made me laugh when Steffi said that. But a real powerful example of the fight against anti-Semitism by non-Jews. Our office was visiting a certain country in the Middle East. I won't name it, but we were meeting with the Ministry of Education, and we had two people in our office. We had several people in our office, but two of the heads. One was the envoy on combating anti-Semitism, and one was a special representative to Muslim communities. And we were pushing this Minister of Education in this Middle Eastern country on the anti-Semitism that was on some of its schools' websites, saying there's blatant anti-Semitism on the websites of your schools. May you please take it down. And when the special envoy to combat anti-Semitism was pushing, there really wasn't any budging happening. And then the special representative to Muslim communities came in and said, as a Muslim, you're a Muslim, I'm a Muslim. As a Muslim, anti-Semitism is never okay. And this is why. And this is ways that I think, coming from Islam, we need to work on this issue. And I don't know what happened after the story. I know the story ends with a change of heart of the Minister of Education actually saying, you know what, I can see this now. You're right. We do need to make changes here. And that just speaks to the power, again, of non-Jewish voices pushing back against anti-Semitism. And I think the same can be said with Black-Jewish relations as well. We have AJC's helped start and spearhead the U.S. Black-Jewish caucus in the House of Representatives, and really trying to find kind of synergies between Black stories and Jewish stories on shared issues. And when African Americans leaders speak out against anti-Semitism, and when Jews speak out against Black racism and our and our activists in that fight, it goes so much further. And so that's kind of one of my hopes for the future in this.
Let me just say, I'm so inspired to be working alongside Holly, knowing that she is kind of living out this incredible allyship as a non-Jewish person who is standing by Jews every day. I imagine our audience is mostly Jewish, and I just want to say that it's also critical for us to stand by other communities. And one of the best ways, I would hope, for us to cultivate allies in other communities is to kind of live that out ourselves, and to follow Holly's example, if you will, and stand by other communities. That's why, for example, it was so important to AJC to convene the Black Jewish Caucus in Congress. That's why it was so important to us to celebrate Juneteenth this year, and to put out some recommendations to Congress for how it can go about conducting important police reform and closing racial gaps in this country, and why it was so important for us to open new offices in Minneapolis and in Louisville in memory of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and to begin to bring our remedy, our way of bringing communities together to those two communities. Those are all examples, obviously, drawn from Black Jewish relations, but we believe that it is critical for us to work across interreligious and interethnic and intercultural divides to bring our communities together.
Go ahead, Holly. Sure.
I was going to jump in one more point because this came up in a question. I just saw it about the Black Lives Matter movement and how do we engage when they might be anti-Semitic or they might be anti-Israel. I actually want to respond to that because of what Steffi just said. And coming from a Christian perspective, if the Jewish community didn't engage with the Catholic Church, which we know is one of the most anti-Semitic institutions, like going back 2 millennia even, and the Christian anti-Judaism, which really set the stage for the Holocaust. It's even after the Holocaust, Jewish organizations, Jewish communal leaders, including AJC, didn't continue to push the Catholic Church and engage with them, even though they might disagree on things, on why they needed to change, which 20 years later would lead to Nostra Aetate, this landmark document, which really changed the course of Jewish-Christian relations. We wouldn't have had that. And I think I'm noticing that there are some of the Jewish community that don't want to engage with Black Lives Matter, in part because of maybe how they feel about Israel. And I think it's important to note that that's not the majority of the movement. There is a movement for Black lives, right, which has a policy on Israel, but the majority of the wider campaign does not. And we shouldn't necessarily, I think, be afraid of engaging. And we need to be there, because we have to educate on Zionism and on Israel and how Jews and Judaism relate to Israel. If we're not there in that, I think that's a big absence. And I think it's a really important, in a similar way that Jews were still engaging with Christians, which they might not have had fondness toward after 1945. It's kind of the fight that we need to pick up still today.
No, thank you. I think your comment was driven by Stanley Cora's message that came in. So no, thanks for addressing that. And I'll just say that at FIU, certainly there is a very strong push to sort of break down these artificial walls and to ensure that Jews and Muslims and Catholics and everyone, non-believers, are all fighting for equality, justice, human rights. These should not have differences, whether you're a certain color or a certain religion, a certain nationality. Everyone should be treated equal. There is a question here, Sefi, that came in from Jeffrey Eisenberg, who writes, much of campus anti-Semitism emanates from opposition to Israel. How hard is it for faculty at some schools to be openly supportive of Israel and or to be critical of faculty who espouse anti-Zionist views?
Thanks for the question, Jeff. David, maybe that's a question for you as a faculty member. I mean, I have thoughts, and I'm happy to offer.
Go ahead, you start, and I can jump in if need be.
I think that it is extremely hard for faculty at some schools, and I don't know if FIU is one of those schools, but I think it is extremely hard for faculty at some schools to be openly supportive of Israel. I think there was recently a study that found that I forget if this was all Ivy League schools or if it was at one particular school, 1.84% of college professors espoused conservative or identified as conservative. Now, I'm not at all saying that supporting Israel is a conservative cause. I don't think it is. In fact, I think it's a progressive cause. But when there is so little ideological diversity, in particular along that one critical axis, then just imagine what it looks like in other areas, including in the Israel space. And we've had, I've worked on issues where professors have been ostracized in their departments, or students have protested professors. There's actually something going on right now at Syracuse University, where students who I guess have nothing better to do because they're locked down wherever they are protesting against a professor in the poli-sci department, demanding that she be fired for her work in support of Israel. I'll say, just kind of in the historical perspective, I was pretty young when this was happening, so some of you may remember it better than I, but people in the Jewish community became quite concerned 20 years ago or so when Gulf money started pouring into American colleges and universities, endowing Middle East studies departments that were kind of codifying the Edward Said school of Middle East studies. And what did the Jewish community do in response? They poured in more money to create Jewish studies departments. Now, Jewish studies is wonderful. I happen to have a degree in history from Columbia and a degree in Talmud and rabbinics from JTS. So I love Jewish studies. But Jewish studies is not a response to anti-Israel perspectives in Middle East studies. And in fact, someone could graduate from a leading institution in this country, having studied lots of, Talmud and Maimonides and Bible, and also having been really indoctrinated into a pretty rabidly anti-Israel perspective of the world. You can double major in Jewish studies and Israel bashing, and it's a sad state of affairs that we deal with. David, has that been your? Do you have any kind of war stories from being a faculty member or from your colleagues that you would share?
I don't have any war stories on it. I mean, my focus is more on Eurasian studies and democracy, human rights, so I don't deal directly with this. But as a Jewish faculty member, I personally have not experienced any of these problems at FIU, and I have not heard of any, and hope that remains the case. So we're running out of time. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to ask each of you, the trends are disturbing. I think people are right to be concerned about all the factors that you listed in your slide, Holly. But how about some words of hope without sounding Pollyannish about the situation? Holly, we'll start with you.
Yes, of course. So words of hope, and I don't think that actually is Pollyannish. I had a good colleague, a good friend of mine, who was the president of the European Union of Jewish Students a couple of years ago, and I called her and I asked her actually about, can you please tell me about the state of anti-Semitism in Europe? Like what's happening? What are you feeling? What's going on? What's wrong? And she said, like, why are you asking about anti-Semitism? Like, let me tell you about the positive things the Jewish community here is doing. Like, we're doing all of this. And she's like, talk about Jewish life, and like Jewish life is thriving in Europe, young European Jewish life. We want to be here. We want to stay. We want to make an impact. And I liked how she turned my question around from like the, as Deborah Lipstadt says, like from that oi to joy, like, focusing on what's positive. And I quote Deborah Lipstadt, not myself, on that comment. But I think we have to remember too, we have come a long way. Like when we look at the last few years and it's looking dire, but when we look back in American history, we are in a much better place for the Jewish American community. And I think there's recognition that in the diaspora, American Jews really do fare the best out of any other diaspora community. And we can't lose sight of that. That doesn't mean that we rest with our laurels, right? There's a lot of work to be done. And I think also we have more allies today in governments, which is a positive thing. There were actually anti-Semitic institutions, in the 30s and 40s, and we don't have that anymore. So we have a strong foundation to move forward. But because anti-Semitism is so different, like I was mentioning, it's so much more complex than it ever was before. We have to have a kind of a multi-pronged strategy to attack it. And that's actually what AJC has brought me in to do. And I'm working with so many people across the agency, including in AJC Miami, actually on trying to work on getting the IWR definition adopted and implemented in Florida, which will be an incredibly useful tool to understand what anti-Semitism is. But it's on all these different levels, David. So and I won't go through my list, but we've got security and we have education and we have our legislation like the No Hate Act and better reporting. So we know where anti-Semitism is coming from. The coalition building, which was an important question, tackling it online and on social media. And I think the two last points is really strengthening our democracy. I think sometimes we take a step back from just fighting anti-Semitism and work toward building our democratic institutions and having that stable and transparent democracy, fighting for pluralism and democratic rights for all. That's when Jews will actually be most safe, when we have that in order. And then the last point I'll mention, and this is hopeful, I think, we're at this like a really high point right now in our society of innovation and creativity. And why can't we use those tools to combat anti-Semitism. I don't think we're thinking proactively enough about how we can use the tools of the 21st century across disciplines, from tech sector to health to business, and bring them into this fight. And that actually excites me. I mean, it's a weird, you know, when you're in this space, you have to have some kind of positive element. You really do. And there's just a lot we haven't tried yet. So that's what I would say.
Ollie, thank you. Sefi, last word to you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. I mean, where else would you rather live, right? Like you look across Europe, you look across Latin America, you look across Asia, certainly in the Middle East, where there's really only one country that Jews can make their home. You know, maybe right now under pandemic conditions, I'd rather live just about anywhere other than here. But if you try to think back before that, or think forward, hopefully not too far into the future, to the post-pandemic, America is still the place where Jews have been, you know, with the exception of Israel, where Jews have been most free, most welcome, most prosperous. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have Jewish grandchildren, and people poo-poo that and say it doesn't say anything about the men themselves. That may be true, but it is a crazy thing to think about, that, you know, one of the totally credible, whether you liked him or not, one of the totally credible front runners in the Democratic primary was a Jewish man, and that the ultimate winner has Jewish grandchildren. In fact, I think Biden's kids have all married Jews, and you know, this is an incredible moment of acceptance for the Jewish community in America, and we just need to make sure that it stays that way. There are these really fringy things that have some social capital right now, that are kind of in vogue a little bit in certain circles, and especially if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, which no one here should do. But in truth, you know, we're blessed to live in America, and we here at AJC are working to make sure that it absolutely stays that way, and that we're improving the situation for Jews elsewhere around the world. Because at the end of the day, no one else is coming to fix anti-Semitism, right? At the end of the day, no one else is going to do this job. And so if we care about it, then it's up to us. And we're going to work every day to ensure that that America stays an incredible place for Jews, that it becomes an even better place for Jews, and that the rest of the world is safe for us.
Well, that's a great note to end on. So let me say to Sefi Kogan and Holly Huffnagel, a huge thanks to you for taking time to join us from California and from New Jersey, respectively. This has been a fascinating conversation, incredibly important. To John Bussell and to Brian and to Michael, our huge thanks to AJC for being such tremendous friends and supporters of FIU and the Green School, and for joining us on this program today. My thanks also to the Ruth K. Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series for their unstinting support for what we do. And to my colleagues here at FIU, to Riga, Andre, Jeanette, Pedro, everybody who has helped put this program together. Thanks to all of you for joining as well, and for sending in some great comments and questions. We really appreciate it. Next week, we'll be back with a webinar on China. So we hope that you will join us then. In the meantime, I want to wish you all well. I'm David Kramer with FIU's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Thanks a lot for joining us, and next year in Jerusalem. Thank you.